It was a cold when I moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for decades, its peeling paint and sagging roof a testament to neglect. The price was a steal, too good to pass up, even with the whispers of its dark history. As I hauled boxes inside, the air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, and the creaking floorboards seemed to groan with every step. I told myself it was just an old house settling, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like damp rot. That first night, I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet down the hall. Then, just as my eyes grew heavy, I heard it. A faint whispering, like voices murmuring beyond the walls. I bolted upright, heart thudding, straining to make out words. The sound faded as quickly as it had begun, leaving me doubting my own senses. The next day I explored the house, determined to shake off the unease. In the attic I found an old trunk coated in dust and cobwebs. Inside were antique dolls, porcelain faces cracked and faded, their painted smiles unnervingly serene. One stood out, a small figure with piercing blue eyes that seemed to track me as I moved. I slammed the trunk shut, a shiver crawling up my spine, and left it there. That night, the whispering returned, louder, more insistent. It seemed to drift, down from the attic. Against every instinct I climbed the stairs, flashlight trembling in my hand. The trunk sat undisturbed, but the blue-eyed doll was perched on top, its head tilted toward me. I hadn't touched it. I swore I hadn't. Panic clawed at my chest as I shoved it back inside and fled, locking my bedroom door behind me. The days blurred into weeks, and the house turned against me. Objects shifted when I wasn't looking. Keys on the counter one minute, gone the next. Doors slammed shut with no wind to blame. I'd wake in the dead of night to find the dolls arranged in a circle around my bed, their blank eyes fixed on me. I'd scream, hurl them back into the attic, but they always returned. The blue-eyed one was the worst. Its cold gaze seemed to bore into my skull, promising something awful. One night I jolted awake, choking. The blue-eyed doll sat on my chest, its tiny porcelain hands clamped around my throat. Its grip was impossibly strong, its weight crushing the air from my lungs. I thrashed, clawing at it, but those lifeless eyes just stared as I gasped. Just as black spots danced in my vision, it released me, tumbling to the floor with a hollow clatter. I scrambled away, sobbing, too terrified to touch it. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I gathered every last doll, stuffed them into trash bags, and drove to a ravine on the edge of town. I flung them over the edge, watching their porcelain bodies shatter against the rocks below. Relief flooded me as I sped back home, convinced the nightmare was over. It wasn't. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices seeping through the walls. Shadowy figures flickered at the edges of my sight, tall, thin shapes that vanished when I turned. Sleep became a battleground. I'd wake drenched in sweat, the voices echoing in my skull. I was unraveling, trapped in a house that refused to let me go. Desperate, I dug into the house's past. At the library, I uncovered records of Elias Blackwood, a doll maker who'd lived here a century ago. The townsfolk had feared him, whispering of dark magic and missing souls. Legend claimed he'd bound the spirits of the dead into his creations, trapping them in porcelain shells. When he died, alone, raving, the dolls remained, silent keepers of his sins. The truth hit me like a punch. The dolls weren't just haunted. They were prisons for restless, furious spirits tied to this house, and now to me. Dumping them hadn't freed me. It had enraged them. That night I heard them return. Tiny footsteps pattered across the floorboards, growing louder, closer. The bedroom door rattled, wood splintering as many somethings, pounded against it. I barricaded it with a dresser, my hands shaking, but I knew I couldn't hide. I had to end this. In the attic, I'd seen an old journal beneath the trunk, Elias's, I realized now. I retrieved it, pages brittle and stained, filled with scrawled spells and mad ravings. One passage stood out, a ritual to release trapped souls. It demanded a sacrifice, a fragment of the caster's own essence given freely. The door groaned behind me, hinges straining. I had no choice. I lit candles, traced symbols in salt, and chanted the words, my voice cracking. I offered a piece of myself, a sliver of my soul, torn away with a wrenching pain that left me gasping. The room iced over, breath fogging in the air. A blinding light erupted, and when it cleared, the dolls lay scattered across the floor, their eyes dull, their bodies still. I collapsed, exhausted,